Welcome back to Dead Good Book Reviews. I'm Judith and you're watching another episode of Overbooked here on the channel. This is the series where I talk about every single book on my shelves because we're trying to unravel a mystery that goes all the way back to ancient Egypt and discover what it means to be human. Today we are talking about Octavia E. Butler's Patternist series. I'm pretty sure that I own this book, the first book in big inverted commas, Wild Seed, because of a book club that Angela over at Literature Science Alliance ran. I'm gonna tag Angela's review of this series somewhere below. I haven't actually watched it yet because I was trying not to just make this video be that, but I'm almost certain it's wonderful, so you should just go check out Angela anyway. But yes, back when I used to do book clubs, discovered book clubs are not a thing that I can do reliably. I schedule myself way too much for that. We did read Wild Seed, and I bought the copy of the book, I read it, I kind of went, great, done, at some point I'll finish that series. That time was the end of 2023. I finally did a reread of Wild Seed and got the rest of the books in this series from the library. Regardless of where books come from, nobody's paying me to talk about books except my patrons, and all opinions are my own. I'm going to keep this as spoiler-free as humanly possible while still talking about the series as a whole. If you do want to go into this series knowing absolutely nothing, this is not the video for you. Pause the video, come back when you've read them, we'll talk then. And I will link the story graph for the series down below in case you want to check out any user-generated content warnings. I would suggest doing it for this series. This is a series that's hard to define genre-wise. It's usually put into science fiction, and I do think that's where it sits well, though I do want to acknowledge that Octavia E. Butler wasn't necessarily trying to write science fiction at the time, though she did love the genre. It was originally published between 1974 and 1980, and there's been a whole bunch of different editions produced since then. These are the most recent ones. I really liked these editions. They come with discussion questions at the end, which I found very helpful as somebody who sometimes likes to explore a book a bit more in my own mind. Also, if maybe you were running a book club, that would be helpful as well. Octavia E. Butler was an American author who sadly died at the age of 58 back in 2006, but before she died she wrote a huge number of things. I am not hugely in the sphere of kind of older sci-fi in particular, so I don't know if this is necessarily entirely true. I believe she is most known for this series, but that's at least where I know her from. I don't know how it feels elsewhere. I'm going to read off my notes. The themes that she wanted to explore in this series were racial and gender-based animosity, ethical implications of biological engineering, question of what it means to be human, ethical and unethical uses of power, how the assumption of power changes people. So all of those themes are kind of tied up in these books. These books are also often put on lists of books that explore Afrofuturism. These books don't strictly fit into that category, but they definitely do have an influence. Both they have been influenced and they continue to influence that kind of genre, so I thought it was worth mentioning at this point. These books are actually about, as I say, unraveling this mystery, this sci-fi journey, this tale of humanity that starts way back in ancient Egypt in this book and continues on way into a hypothetical future where humanity splits out into different groups. We have the Patternists, who have kind of telepathic powers. We have the Clayarchs, which is to do with a mutated disease, and Mutes, which are humans. And the series is kind of, how do we get here? Because reading order is complicated with this one. I read them in chronological order of the events of the books, which is very different to publication order. I think that's partly because I started with Wild Seed the first time, and that was the book that I already had on hand. I'm going to come on to reading order later on in the video, but just so you know, that's not publication order. So the books in chronological order that I read are Wild Seed, this first one, Mind of My Mind, Clay's Ark, and The Pattern Master. There is also another book called Survivor, which Octavia E. Butler basically went, I don't like that one, I'm not reprinting it, which I wholly support. I think that's iconic behaviour. And there's also some short stories and things where they've collected things together, but those are the 4 books that I have read. One of the things I really liked about this series, particularly in Wild Seed, and it's going to keep coming back as a theme of this video, I liked Wild Seed the best. I have a lot of thoughts on that. I think these books draw on a lot of themes and ideas that we see a lot in sci-fi, particularly superhero sci-fi, especially the more niche superhero sci-fi. I'm not talking the Marvel tie-ins or anything, but a lot of the broader stuff. So humans having superpowers, humans developing powers, experimenting on people to give them superpowers, that kind of thing. There's a lot to do with like bioengineering in this, the ethics of that. But because it's not framed as a superhero story, and I think because it was written in a time before we were so saturated with that kind of narrative, it feels incredibly fresh, it feels incredibly interesting, and it's a really cool look at all of that sort of stripped away from trope, which I think was very fascinating. I think it's really obvious that a lot of fiction has since been influenced by this series and other works of its kind. But here at the beginning, in big inverted commas, because superheroes came before this, it feels very, very free of a lot of cliche, which I appreciated. It also means that where things might feel a little bit cliched, they don't, because you know it's not drawing off that trope. I really liked the exploration of those kind of big and epic, worldwide, world-changing struggles that happen in this series, without it feeling like a superhero book. It's very much more tied to individuals, even if those individuals are incredibly powerful and they're very close relationships. It's a very, very interesting way of structuring this kind of story. In terms of books exploring what humanity is capable of and what it means to be human, I think these are fascinating little character studies. None of the books are very long. I'm trying to imagine them physically in my hands. I think Wild Seed was the longest. I haven't actually checked the page counts. They're not long books, but they pack a lot in. So it never feels slow because of that. But it also never felt super overwhelming. I think it probably did the first time I read Wild Seed. But if I'm thinking back to then, I wasn't reading a lot of adult fiction at the time. I loved the character studies that appear in this series. I think particularly Clay's arc was a very interesting character study, and Mind of My Mind, I think as well. Really, really interesting. The other big selling point, I think, of this series is it feels incredibly timeless. There is some fiction that you will go back and read. I think particularly epic fantasy, more so than a lot of other things. You go back and read it and you go, I can tell that this was written before this date because of these reasons. And while there's some stuff in here that obviously feels a little bit dated or predicts a future that didn't happen, it still feels incredibly timeless to me as a series. And I think that's a testament to great science fiction. Some of the best science fiction, in my opinion, is the stuff that stands the test of time. I think even if the dates and the timeline shifts, you should still feel the sense of moving into the future versus the past and kind of that energy to it, and I definitely felt that in this series. So if you're looking for an older sci-fi to read, I would recommend this compared to some of the other ones I've read. If you are planning on picking these up, I mentioned it at the start of the video, but do look up the content warnings. There are some moments that are more difficult to read, particularly to do with violence, and there's a lot to do with eugenics kind of adjacent things in here. I would check out those content warnings, make sure you're reading what you're comfortable reading. Next, I'll touch on that reading order. So, as I say, I read them chronologically within the plot, and I know I'd spoken to Angela about it, and she said she really regretted not reading Patternmaster first. And I suspect it's the kind of thing where, because there's no way to delete these from my brain and read them in a whole new order, I will either have to wait a few years when I will inevitably have forgotten everything and read them again in a different order, or just accept that that was my reading experience and enjoy it for what it was. I personally really liked picking up Wild Seed first. I think it gives a lot of context, particularly for Mind of My Mind, but I can understand why reading it the other way around might make more sense. I actually wonder if this is the kind of series where it's not going to necessarily negatively impact how you enjoy the books, but it will change how you enjoy the books, depending on where you start. Weirdly, I think it's the perfect series for being in libraries, because you know how it is with libraries where you can never find the first book in a series, ever, and you always end up saying, well, maybe I'll just read book 2. In this case, I don't think it would make a disastrous impression on your reading. Feel free to argue with me about it, but I do think there are bits of all of them, and because they're all so kind of confusing and a little bit just throwing you in at the deep end in terms of the narrative, I still think it would work. I'm really glad that I finished this series. I'm really glad that I took the time to read the other books and to reread Wild Seed, because I enjoyed it much more on a reread, and I suspect this is the kind of series where I would grow to love it a lot more if I continually reread them. I don't plan to anytime soon. Partly because of the reason that there always is, which is that I have finite time on this earth and I can't reread every single series ever, but also because I found them very challenging books in terms of the content. I think that there are some really difficult scenes, and that's just not something I tend to search for in books that I want to read again and again. So for me personally, this isn't going to be a series that I reread. It's not going to be a book that I keep on my shelves. I'm going to be unhauling it after this video, but I'm really glad that I had the chance to read it, and if a situation came up again where we were going to do a book club for it, I wouldn't say, no, I'm never reading that again. It's just not something I'm prioritizing right now. Just in case that's useful information for you to have. Other things you might want to read. I haven't read oodles of vintage sci-fi, so a lot of this is more new. Please excuse me for that. I wondered about The Memory Librarian by Janelle Monáe, which is a collection of short stories. Really recommend the audiobook. I liked the audiobook a lot. Loved it. Pretty much any of Nnedi Okorafor's work I think would be very interesting. I would recommend Remote Control. That's one of my absolute favourites. They're very dark and look up the content warnings, but River Solomon's work, particularly Sorrowland, is one of my favourites. And I think I felt a lot of similarities between that and these books. And likewise, look up those content warnings, but Tochi Onyebuchi's work, such as Riot Baby, highly recommend. Well worth checking out. Should you read the Patternist series? I would say yes, I think at least once. I suspect it is a really good book to read with someone else, so you can have a bit of discussion time on it. I think reading it just for me meant I didn't have the time to kind of expand on the ideas or ruminate on the implications of the plot as much as perhaps if I'd read it with someone else. But I'm a lone wolf always, so that didn't happen. I don't think it's a must read, especially if you're not in the mood for it. I would wait for the right time and read them then. Have you read these books? Do you have plans to? Do you have any similar recommendations? Let me know down in the comments below. While you're commenting, if you haven't already, please do subscribe. It makes me feel loved and appreciated. You can also come hang out on Discord where we have chill chats about books. I'd like to say an enormous thank you to all the ghosts who haunt me over on Patreon. They support the channel and in return get early access to videos, bonus content, access to my weekly live streams and more. If you'd like to join their number, that's linked below as well. Thank you so much to you for watching. That's all from me and I will see you in the next one, which I think is the last one of the year.